This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and even analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Okay, in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the Sony A1, which was announced this week. This is a really impressive camera that they put out. I am really impressed with it, and I'm going to share my opinion with you today. It's cool that it does 8K video, but believe it or not, that's actually not what I'm impressed with at all. This camera opens up a lot of possibilities due to the technology that they've been able to work out using the stacked CMOS configuration. So we're going to go over some of the features and some of the things that this camera does, and it's really impressive. So if it's not the ability to make 8K videos with this camera that's interesting to me, then what is the feature? Well, what I am most impressed with is what they've been able to do with this new stacked CMOS sensor. So real quick, a little technical overview. With digital cameras, we use what we call CMOS sensors, and just the long and short of it is that with a CMOS sensor, when we started switching to those, and it's been a number of years now, it's a good sensor. It does well in low light. There's a lot you can do with it, but it is kind of crude in the sense that it does not light up all the pixels at once when you take the exposure. It actually scans the sensor like a scanner would. And so it goes line by line. And with bigger sensors, this does become problematic. Now your phone does it and it's just fine because it's a teeny tiny sensor. They can support pretty fast readout. But especially when you get into medium format, like with Fujifilm or Hasselblad, the exposure might be 1/800th of a second, but it takes a lot longer for that sensor to scan. And so what you're gonna see in the end is what we call the jello effect. Most often it has banding problems and fluorescent lighting. There's a lot of issues that you can get with that. Some of these are corrected by introducing a mechanical shutter. So we still have a mechanical shutter like we did back in the old film days. And so we do have the ability to use electronic shutter, but it has limitations to it, and those are usually corrected. Now, what Sony did with the A9 and the A9 II is they developed what they call a stacked CMOS sensor configuration. This is the only manufacturer that does this right now. What it means is you put another layer in there of integrated memory. It's kind of complex how it works, but it speeds up that delivery of that scan time. And so what we've done now is we've moved, this is still full frame, but to a 50 megapixel sensor, and they've improved that scan time. I think it's like 1.5x. That combined with this new processor that they're doing is unbelievable. So now we're able to do more with the electronic shutter, and this is closer to the realization of what we call a global shutter, which is basically a sensor where every pixel fires at the same time. We're much closer to that than we've been. So what does that enable us to do? Well, a lot. Flash sync speeds. So in other words, what is the fastest shutter speed that you can use and still get flash to sync with it is now 1/400th of a second. This is way faster than what we've seen with mechanical shutters on modern cameras that are focal plane. In other words, Hasselblad, yes, it's a leaf shutter and it supports really high sync speeds, but that's been a problem. And really with modern camera design, we've been locked into around 1/100th, 1/125th of a second for a long time now, and this boosts it now to 1/400th. And if you're in the APS-C crop mode, it will go to 1/500th of a second. Now, why is this interesting and why is this important? If you shoot sports and you're using flash because you're shooting indoors, you need those high speeds if you want to freeze action. Otherwise, you're going to be subject to motion blur. If you want to know more about this, my dear friend Blair Bunting, who is a wonderful photographer, wrote an entire article on this. He does a lot of sports photography. He's done a lot of automobile photography where you're dealing with things that move really fast in bright light. You still need to use a flash, and how do you get that to work? And it's on Petapixel. I will put a link to that in the show description, but this is huge. The other thing that's really big, because now we have faster readouts coming off of those sensors, is we have electronic shutter capabilities with flash. So this has never been possible before. Usually you have to have that mechanical shutter to get flash to work. So one of the interesting things, if you've ever shot on an A9, I remember the first time I got an opportunity to shoot on the original A9, that does, 20 frames a second of burst shooting with no blackout. And it's weird. If you turn off the fake shutter noise and you're just shooting away, it's got a little black frame that it's telling you that it's got a shot. It's very unobtrusive in the frame, but it's really eerie because you can actually shut all this stuff off and it's just shooting away at super fast speeds and you don't even realize it. Imagine now being able to shoot, not hear anything, and just see flashes going off. That's going to be wild. But anyway, a little bit of a party trick, but I think it's going to be something that is very useful, and it's going to increase the range of what you're able to do with still photography. I know video is the big selling point because we've got these fast shutter speed readouts, and we've got a 50 megapixel sensor, and Sony are saying they're going to do this without overheating. But that, to me, is the most important thing. Now, I do want to talk about video as well, because there are some really important things to know about this camera. But first, I want to give a shout shout out to our sponsors today, who are the awesome folks over at squarespace.com. Squarespace is the easiest way to build a photography website and earn money while doing it. So start with one of their award-winning templates and build your site. You can drag and drop images to build beautiful galleries, so there's no code to write and no server to manage. Squarespace also have tools to make your website work for you. They now have member-only areas for managing an audience and communicating directly, complete with audience insights. Make money with their advanced e-commerce tools for merchandising, inventory management, secure payments, and you can also extend e-commerce with Squarespace extensions. These are third-party tools that let you manage inventory, bookkeeping, filing sales tax, and even shipping items across the globe. You can take your photography and turn it into a business that works for you. So head over to squarespace.com and sign up for the free trial. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/AOP and save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Once again, that is squarespace.com/AOP. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Okay, so now let's talk about the insanity that is 8K video. So yes, this camera will record in 8K. There are some limitations. I think it's important to discuss. So first of all, it records to an H.265 file format. It is long GOP only, so there's no all-intra with 8K, even going externally. And so you're not going to have raw video output. It's going to be a little limiting in that regard. There's also a 30-minute record limit. Now, I have been told by Sony that this is, they feel, a somewhat conservative limitation. In other words, if you consider another camera from another brand that came out this year and kind of disappointed in terms of overheating, what happens is if you're able to get 30 minutes of recording and the camera does get hot, it's not like you can just turn it off and start recording and get another 30 minutes. It starts getting hot, it's going to shut down. And so I appreciate the fact that they were a little bit conservative with this. This means you'll be able to record for 30 minutes and then you'll probably be able to get to another 30-minute clip, and they've kind of distributed it like that. Of course, these are still camera designs. That's the form factor, that's the body. So the heat dispersion is going to be the biggest problem. This has really similar heat dispersion techniques built into it, much like we saw with the A7S III. And so I have not used the camera yet, so we'll see. It kind of blows my mind that people really want 8K or think they really want 8K. You're talking about big file sizes, you're talking about big demands on your actual camera. You're talking about big file storage, and what is the delivery format? So video is not quite like high resolution stills. You know, you are subject to what the delivery method is going to be. So if I'm putting a video on YouTube that I shoot in 4K, most people are not watching it in 4K. They're watching it in 1080p or sometimes less. A lot of that has to do with, are they on their phone? Are they watching it on television? What's the internet connection like? Broadcast is another thing. Most broadcast is not done in 8K. Most movies are not displayed in theaters, well, at all right now, but even when they are, you would be surprised if most of them were actually 8K. People think they want 8K because it's a big spec and it's a big number, but I actually question that. Now, the other argument is, well, you can crop in on 8K. Well, I'm not really convinced yet that spending time in post-production cropping is a good use of one's time. I think lens selection and actual composition while you're shooting is probably better, but hey, that's just me. I know that some people want 8K, so yes, this delivers. I was actually more interested in what it does with 4K, because when you have a 50 megapixel sensor, you're looking at a lot of downsampling to get a 4K file out of that. And it turns out it does it pretty well. Now, what Sony are saying is this will actually use 5.8K oversampling down to 4K. So you're going to get this without any cropping or pixel binning. We'll see how this looks in the end. Of course, there is some reduction that has to be done even with oversampling, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it produces a good 4K file. But I still think this is why a camera like the A7S III is still very important. So the biggest question on my mind is that the A1 represents a huge bump, and it has a huge price tag. It's a $6,500 US camera. So it's, I think, the first of what we've seen in Sony's lineup, ironically, as a flagship. Back in the DSLR days, Nikon, Canon always had their flagship model, and its flagships come in this price range and sometimes higher, and that's what we're seeing here. So I think on price alone, it doesn't necessarily make older models obsolete. I think there's still a place for the A9, actually, especially if you're shooting sports and you don't need to deliver 50 megapixel files. You can get a 24 megapixel camera, which will work just fine. There's still a legitimate use for that. I think, especially with the basic model, as Sony calls it, with what we're going to see APS-C this year, hopefully with the A7 IV. I think that's still a very valid option. I also think the A7S III is an incredible option, and I know a lot of people don't agree with the 12 megapixel still camera, but I think it's awesome for 12 megapixel stills in really low light and obviously video. The one camera that does concern me, and I definitely own one, is the A7 R4. We still got the old menu system in that camera, and this kind of does everything better. It is more expensive, and it's 10 megapixels less than the other cameras, so it's, you know, it's really hard to say. I think that the A7 R4 is really the question mark, and what'll be interesting to see what they do with an A7 R5 when that day comes. You'll get updated menus, of course, but I think your megapixel count's going to get even higher. So obviously, we're talking testosterone specs here. 8K video, 60 megapixels, 80 megapixels. What's next? 120 megapixels out of a full frame? Are we talking about 12K video? I don't know. I would love to hear from you guys and see what you think. But do another video on this as well, because I think this entire industry is in a very interesting place right now. But because we enable new things to be done, we get caught up in the spec numbers. I'm serious. I think the A1, it's this fast sensor, and what you're going to be able to do with flash and other things is going to be unbelievable. Drop me a comment below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.